Welcome to examination techniques for PFM1, public sector accounting. To present, I'm Velena Skangwa. To introduce the techniques, I wish to remind all the candidates that sit for this paper PFM1, that there are certain things that you need to do right for you to maximize the marks that you get during the examination. And this is what we shall spend the next few minutes talking about, hoping that this is going to improve the performance of the students in this particular paper. First of all, I wish to remind the candidates about the format of this paper. This paper has got two sections, Section A and Section B. Section A will contain a one compulsory question carrying 40 marks. In Section B, you are going to have 4 questions which are non-compulsory, from which you need to select 3 questions. Each one of them will carry 20 marks. So the total marks from Section B is actually 60. The examination duration is 180 minutes of writing time, while you have 15 minutes reading time. The 15 minutes reading time is supposed to be put to effective use to also help you to achieve higher marks in this particular exam. Simple arithmetic will bring us to the fact that for each mark that you are going to get in this paper, you need to spend 1.8 minutes. So if a question, for example, has got 20 marks, you need to spend not more than 36 minutes answering that particular portion of the question. Otherwise, if you spend more than 36 minutes on any particular 20-mark question, you put yourself in a situation where you will be disadvantaged to attempt the other questions that may actually be easier than the one that you have spent too much time on. In talking about the techniques, I wish to remind you about the common verbs that are normally used in this paper, which come from Bloom's taxonomy. This paper is a low-level paper, and because it's a low-level paper, what you have are actually command words or common verbs that come from the first 2 levels of Bloom's taxonomy that are called remembering and understanding. So in the remembering level, you normally get command words in the questions like list, identify, define, mention, who, why, which, and what. So these are very, very basic command words. What is important is when you're answering any question in this paper, you need to strictly follow the meaning of this command word. So if, for example, a command word says list, provide a list of ethical principles for professional accountants in public service, what you are supposed to do is merely list those principles. You are not necessarily required to explain them. But if a question says list and explain, meaning that you need to list them, but provide an explanation for each list of those ethical principles for professional accountants. In the understanding level, this is where you get command words like describe, illustrate, discuss, compare and contrast, explain. So depending on the command word that has been used in the question, it's not like you just need to write everything you know about a particular variable. Follow the command word. For example, if you are asked to explain, meaning provide some simple, clear understanding of that particular variable. If a question says discuss, it means that you need to go deeper than just providing a simple explanation. Talk about the positive aspect of the variable, talk about the negative aspect of the variable, and any other item that may be relevant about this particular variable. It means you are discussing. So the way you will explain your answer depends on the kind of the command word that has been used. I think from the past exams, it has actually been noticed that some candidates will not achieve higher marks because they are not paying attention to the kind of command word that has been used in the question. There are general competencies that any student that is going to sit for this particular paper must achieve. What are these competencies? First of all, you need to know what are the many objectives of public sector accounting. What is the difference between public sector accounting and commercial accounting? You also need to understand the concepts and the bases for accounting in public sector. All these areas must extensively be covered by any candidate that is preparing for an exam in this particular paper. You need to understand what is known as the chart of accounts. What are the components of this chart of accounts? What are the categories of government revenue and government expenditure? What are the sources of government revenue and so on? These are the many areas of knowledge that any candidate that is going to sit for this paper should spend a lot of time and understand before they can sit for this particular exam. There are what we call common mistakes that candidates that sit for this paper normally make. What are these common mistakes? So first of all, there's what we call failing to allocate appropriate time to a particular question, and also hence failing to write an equivalent amount of your answer based on the number of marks allocated to this particular question. So exactly what am I talking about? If you have a question that is carrying 8 marks, for example, and you want to spend 1 hour attempting this particular question, that is one mistake that you are making. You cannot spend 1 hour on an 8 marks question. What about the time for the 92 marks? Where is it going to come from? So it's important that any candidate who is preparing for an exam in PFM1 knows how to allocate appropriate amount of time based on the marks to a particular question. So like I said earlier, 1.8 minutes for 1 mark. So the 8 marks you multiply by 1.8 minutes for you to know how much time to spend and also how much to write. If you are answering a question that has 8 marks, you cannot write 2 pages. Because the 2 pages you are going to write entail that you will take a lot of time and hence disadvantaging yourself for other questions, which are the 92 marks remaining. So look at the marks allocated. If there are 8, you probably need to raise 8 points, or sometimes, depending on the nature of the question, you may require to raise 4 points, well explained. That will give you the 8 marks that are allocated to this particular question. The other mistake that candidates that sit for this paper make is actually misapplication of a command word. So like I mentioned, the common command words in this paper: list, explain, describe, discuss, okay? Define. So if you are actually going to provide a definition for a question that is saying discuss, you have lost it. And many a times, if a question asks you to discuss, you are actually supposed to give different views from the different angles of that particular variable that has to be discussed. But if you are just going to define, you are simply stating in simple terms what it is. And so you cannot achieve any higher marks. A discussed question will naturally have higher number of marks than a defined question. So you lose out on achieving the appropriate amount of marks. Another mistake the candidates make, spending too much time on one question. So what it is all the questions in section B, for example, are 20-mark questions. You need to give them equal time. It is only the section A question that is 40 marks. That is supposed to be written within 72 minutes. The rest are supposed to be written within 36 minutes. So if you are going to attempt one question in section B and spend 40 minutes, 1 hour, that is a mistake. It's a common mistake, because it will be very difficult for you to catch up on the unnecessary too much time that you have actually spent on one question. Earlier I mentioned of 15 minutes reading time. Okay? Another mistake that candidates that sit for this paper make is actually to idle around during the 15 minutes, looking around what everyone else is doing instead of doing your own things. So if you are told you are in the 15 minutes reading time, may you avoid doing nothing. That is the best time that you can use to actually select which questions in section B you are actually going to attempt. Not only selecting the questions that you are going to attempt, but also putting them in the order in which you are going to attempt. I advise students from time to time that you are better off starting with the question that you think is easier to you, and you end with the one that you think is difficult to you. So if out of the 3 questions you are supposed to attempt, maybe question 5 is the easiest to you, may you rank it 1 for purpose of the order in which you are going to attempt them. If question 4 is the next easiest, you rank it 2 for the purpose of the order in which you are going to attempt these questions. That way, you are at an advantage of actually achieving higher marks when you attempt these easier questions first. Because if you leave them up to the very end, you may just be disappointed with yourself that you are told it's time up and you spent all your time trying to struggle with the most difficult question. So the mistake that you must avoid is to actually start with the most difficult. Rank them, starting with the one that you think is very easy. Another mistake candidates that are sitting for this paper make is without doing enough question practice. Question practice helps candidates a lot. And the way you practice, you are supposed to get the questions and attempt them under exam conditions. Meaning, don't over-relax yourself. You get a question, if it's a 20 marks, time yourself. I'm starting to write my answer now. And what time should I end? And check how much you cover in terms of answering that question. If you do your question practice that way, it will actually improve your efficiency, your speed of writing in the exam. And it puts you at an advantage of actually achieving higher marks in the shortest possible time when you're actually writing the actual exam, if you have been spending a lot of time doing that. Okay? Now, when you're preparing for this exam, you need to do a lot of planning and management of your skills. That will help you achieve the greatest of the marks. Follow that planning very well. And this planning has got to do with allocation of your time to each question in the exam. So question 1 needs 72 minutes. If you are going to start writing at 9:15, can you label at the end of that question to say stop at 10:27, for example, because then that will be 72 minutes. If you are going to start answering the second question at 10:27, label that second question. And your second question is not necessarily question 2. It could be question 5, as long as you labeled it that it will be your second question. Label that you are going to stop at 11:03. Your third labeled question, state that you are going to stop writing your answer there at 11:39, so that you allocate your time equally to avoid disadvantaging yourself when it comes to, losing out marks on easier questions that you may have failed to make any attempt of. The next thing in the planning stage and the management of your exam preparation is that you will definitely not attempt these questions in any chronological order. So make sure that you correctly label them in the order in which you are going to attempt. Like I have indicated, starting with the easiest question, ending with the one you think is the most difficult. Okay? Now, I will take you through some questions that came in the June 2019 exam, where I am trying to show you how you would have approached the answering of these particular questions. So the first question, which is a Section A compulsory question that carries 40 marks, had a number of parts, A, B, C, D, E. The first part was asking candidates to explain the many objectives of International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. And the marks allocated were 4. So for 4 marks, and the command word used there is explain. So how do you approach this kind of a question? To explain is to make clear in simple sentences. So you don't go to details of writing a full paragraph with a lot of sentences. No. For 4 marks, you simply need to put 4 nice sentences that are talking about the objectives of the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. For each item that you are going to explain in brief, making clear what their objective is. So for example, to promote the use of public sector international accounting standards. The next point would be to actually develop an accruals-based public sector accounting standards. Those are the objectives. If you mention 4 of them, that is enough to give you those 4 marks. You will not spend your time providing paragraphs and paragraphs, 2 pages for the 4 marks. You will disadvantage yourself because you are going to eat into the time for questions that are actually carrying more marks, like 10, 12. So you look at the marks, and that should determine the way you are going to put down your points. The other part of this particular question, which is part B, asked candidates to distinguish between. So I'm trying to emphasize there the command word, distinguish between direct expenditure and recoverable advances. Again, this is 4 marks question. So what is it that you do to make sure that you get all the 4 marks? When you're told to distinguish, you are actually being asked to emphasize the difference between the variables. So in giving the difference, first of all, you need to know, the mere definition of each variable. In explaining that, definition, you are actually automatically giving the difference as long as it comes out that this particular definition is different from the other definition. If, for instance, you do not seem to bring out the difference, you may be given the 2 marks out of the 4 marks. You could have lost out. So the emphasis is, what is the command word? The command word is distinguish. How are the 2 variables different one from the other? If you simply state what it is and it's not bringing out the difference, you will definitely be given something in proportion and not getting the full marks.
Take your career prospects to the next level with Zika.
Our diploma in accountancy is an essential qualification if you're planning on entering the accounting profession.
The Zika tax program at both certificate and diploma level equips you with an enhanced understanding of the field of taxation.
Our diploma in public sector financial management is ideal for accountants or trainee accountants working in the public sector.
And CA Zambia, a respected designation designed to ensure that graduates are highly trained to hold senior positions in the workplace.
You can study through flexible options like self-study, as well as part-time or full-time through our accredited tuition providers.
Zika sponsors the top CA Zambia graduate to the One Young World Summit for Young Leaders and also offers scholarships to the top university accountancy graduates from recognized universities.
Visit zika.co.zm now for more information or find us on Facebook and LinkedIn.
Don't delay. Your future awaits.
Part C of question 1 asked candidates to explain the information needs of internal and external users of public sector accounting information and outlining their information needs. Okay? So what is it that you needed to pay attention to this particular question? When you are required to provide the users can be listed. And if the question goes further to say provide information needs for this particular user, you need to go further as well. So there are two components: explaining the internal and external users, as well as providing the information needs of these internal and external users. So the mistake that candidates are likely to make on this particular question, and it was carrying 8 marks, is actually to maybe concentrate their energies on just identifying the users. It means already you cannot achieve all the 8 marks. You're supposed to identify the users and explain the information needs, meaning what are they going to use the public sector accounting information for. Those are the information needs of these particular users. So for instance, one internal user, the president and the ministers, what are they going to use the public sector accounting information for? To make their operational decisions. So the ministers are directly involved in the operations of various public departments. So they need the information about how these departments have performed for them to make future decisions as to what needs to be done and what needs not to be done. So you need to be complete. There are certain questions in this paper that will comprise of, more than one particular part within a question. And this one is a very good example. You just have to satisfy all the requirements, not only meeting the requirements of one requirement of the question. No. The other question in this paper, part D, required the candidates to discuss the factors that are to be taken into account in appraising the need for retention of financial records. This was a 10 marks question, and the command word used is discuss. So when you are told to discuss, first of all, you are discussing the factors. Start by identifying the factors. What are these factors that need to be taken into account in appraising why information needs to be retained for more than a particular period? When you have identified, provide explanation. Why is that a factor? So for instance, we say usefulness of information will actually determine whether this information needs to be retained or not. So when you state to say the usefulness of information, you have identified the factor. You need to back it with an explanation. So certain information, once a transaction has taken place, it may never be needed again in the future in any way. But certain information, once a transaction has taken place, it will be necessary to keep the information for future reference. For instance, all information pertaining to legal transactions, maybe a situation where a company has employed people and these people have been given contracts of employment. Contracts of employment are the aspects of the operation of the law. You cannot afford to put aside these documents because even after 50 years, even after an individual has retired, they may come back to this particular company, maybe even sue the company and say, the way you actually got rid of me was against the law and I've sued you. And so if you have thrown away the document, it becomes very difficult for you to back up yourself in the courts of law. So it is the nature of the usefulness of the information that is vital and will determine whether information should be retained in the financial records or should actually be thrown away. Okay? The part 2 of this particular question D asked the candidates to identify financial records that are of archival value that is required to be retained in a permanent form. So the key word and the common verb here is identify. When a question says identify, you are not required to provide any explanation. Simply identify the type of information that should be kept in permanent form in this particular organization or public sector entity. So for example, if you say, information related to contracts of employment, you put a full stop there. You don't even need to explain because the question has said identify. So for 4 marks there, you need to look at 4 points that you identify and you are good to go to achieve your 4 marks. Okay? Part E of the question asked candidates to explain how information is used in the management of public debt. So how is the integrated financial management system used in the management of a public debt for 4 marks? So you don't have to explain a lot of things for 4 marks. Highlight the important points, how the integrated system will actually be applicable in managing public debt. The 4 points are adequate to give you the 4 marks. Then the other part was asking for mere explanation of centralization, decentralization, distributed database, independent units. The 3 for 6 marks, meaning you need to identify at least a point, and that will be enough to give you the 2 marks for each item of the 3 items that you need to provide description for. So what are the many features of a centralized system, decentralized system, distributed database, independent units? When you bring in 2 of the features of each of these systems, that is enough to give you the 6 marks in total. So that is about the first question in the June 2019 question paper. I will take you to the very last question that came in this exam. This question was asking candidates to explain the 5 fundamental principles of professional ethics. So the command word here is actually explain the 5 fundamental principles of professional ethics, giving practical examples of actions that entail breach of the principle by a professional accountant for 20 marks. So the guideline that I provide on this particular question is pay attention to the command word. You are asked to explain. What are you supposed to explain? 5 fundamental ethical principles. So first of all, identify the principles, the integrity, the objectivity, professional competence, due care, professional behavior, confidentiality. After you identify, provide an explanation of each one of them. Remember, this question was carrying 20 marks. So if you just identify them, you list them, you are far from getting the 20 marks. Maybe 2 marks can come to you. So you are supposed to identify, explain each one of them briefly. Now, the last part of the question required that you give practical examples of actions that entail breach of the principle by a professional accountant. Meaning you needed to sit down and think through practical situations, not textbook explanation, no. So for example, you visualize yourself in that particular office as a professional accountant. What is it that you need to do to breach the integrity fundamental principle? You ask yourself, you get yourself an answer, and that's what you put down. So if you are lacking integrity, you don't have the truth in you. So think about what you do that entails you cheating on either your employer or fellow employees or others outside the organization. You are cheating on them with your action. That is the example that you needed to give. If we talk about confidentiality as a fundamental principle, you could have identified, you could have explained. But the second part of the question required a practical example where there is actually a breach of confidentiality. So ask yourself to say, what is it that I would do in my office to actually breach confidentiality principle? Okay? So you know quite all right, your organization is trying to negotiate a particular transaction. And there are certain things that are being discussed in-house that the organization plans to do for them to win that particular tender. And then you get the information, whether it is for your own gain with that particular organization that has to deal with your organization, and you take that information away. You are breaching confidentiality principle. You don't have to get what you know about the organization you work for outside for your own personal gain. So when you give such kind of an example, you are actually effectively answering the second part. In fact, this particular question must have a higher proportion of marks being allocated to the practical example than to identifying and explaining just a fundamental principle. If you think about professional competence and due care, for example, you identify, you explain, and then you give a practical example where there's a breach. So under what circumstances would someone breach the professional competence and due care principle? So if I'm employed as an accountant and I'm given a task to perform, but I fail, lamentably fail, I have actually breached. It means I'm incompetent. I'm not able to do the job that I'm employed for. Okay? In another context, there's the due care aspect. If I am working for my organization attending to this particular client, but in the process, I actually mess up things with this particular client where I fail to represent my organization well because of the lack of competence, okay? But I could not inform my fellows back in my office that, my dear peers, I'm not able to go and perform for this client because I think I lack ABCD knowledge. So I want to show that, you know, no one can do it but myself. But you go there, you fail. So you could have failed to provide due care for this particular client, and you will bring discredit to your organization, even to the body that you report to as an accountant. So those are practical examples that were supposed to be brought on board on this particular question for you to achieve the 20 marks. It is not easy to get the 20 marks, and I know that a lot of candidates that may have sat for this particular paper, they really did not, you know, bring a lot of practical examples, but just explain the things generally. But the question said, bring a practical example. Identifying and explaining fundamental principles is the most straightforward thing. But to give a practical example, I'm sure a lot of candidates at this particular sitting may have found themselves wanting. So that is what you need to do. Pay attention to the command words. Some questions will have more than one command word. Can you make sure that you address each one of them? If you address part of the command word, you leave out the other, you are likely to find yourself wanting, you will not achieve the full marks allocated to this particular question. Okay? Other important information, general information, when you're preparing for an exam, few hours before the exam, avoid taking caffeinated foodstuffs. Don't drink too much coffee because it will keep you awake for now as you want to break the night, and it's even not good to break a night before the exam date. So avoid caffeinated foodstuffs so that you are not disadvantaged in terms of the energy and the concentration that you need in the exam room. You need to have enough sleep a day before the exam. You need to engage yourself in physical exercise to remain focused and active as well as fit as a student. Avoid any negative talks from your peers because you may be tempted to actually believe what they are saying is very true. Negative talks such as this particular paper is very difficult, you will not manage it, you need to break 4 nights for you to pass the exam. Avoid such kind of groups. Have confidence in yourself so that when you go to the exam room, you are actually, active and full of positivity that will help you remain focused and concentrate. In conclusion, I wish to state that your resolution from inception is key to your success. Be inquisitive to find out from those that have a success story as far as that paper is concerned. If you are able to communicate with your friends that have gone before you, that will be a source of motivation. Thank you for listening to this presentation, and I wish everyone the best whatever time that they want to sit for this particular paper.